Hi everyone, Holly from Safe for Kids here, and I'm so excited to be interviewing a guy I met back in 2018 in the States. I followed his work forever, and I'm just in awe of the impact that he's having the conversation about porn. So, Gabe, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Holly.
So, Gabe, how long have you been campaigning about the harms of pornography, and can you tell us your story?
Yeah, so I first realized I had a problem with porn back in 2011. So a little over 10 years is when I first realized I had a problem. That was when I reached a point after watching internet pornography all through my developmental years as an adolescent, as a teenager. I reached a point when I was 23 and I went to have sex with a girl I found extremely attractive, and my body could not respond. And so that sent me on a desperate search for answers to what my problem was. And I found something that absolutely blew my mind. I stumbled across forums with tens of thousands, now hundreds of thousands and millions of guys with the same story, that they used internet porn for several years and eventually could no longer be aroused by anything other than internet porn. They became dependent on that specific stimulus, and that's what happened to me. And so long story short, I started to get educated on the neuroscience of how that happens, the brain science of how the arousal template can be conditioned to something like Pavlov's dog that salivates when he hears the bell. He knows it's time to eat. A lot of people are conditioning their sexual excitement and arousal to that ringing of the bell, except it's on a phone or a laptop or something like that. So our natural innate libido, if you will, is being wired to pixels on a screen and constant novelty and swiping and clicking. And I was just fascinated by the science of sexual conditioning and the science of addiction and what happens in the brain. And I was a young guy with erectile dysfunction, and no one was talking about this. And so I found a fantastic website by Gary Wilson. He started yourbrainonporn.com back in 2011, and I stumbled into that. And I found out that I could recover. And I was in a really dark place during recovery, which I can get into. But essentially, I found something that was super helpful on my recovery journey. And that was knowing what I did to myself and knowing what I need to do to recover. And that's what I did. And during that journey, I noticed that, on those forums I mentioned, where there were so many guys out there suffering, most of them were anonymous, just desperately searching for answers. I noticed that they needed more help, and there was a desperate need for awareness to be raised. And so towards the end of 2012, I started speaking publicly. And I actually went on Gary Wilson's, he had a radio show temporarily, and I was one of the first, porn addicts he interviewed. And ever since, that interview, and I started helping guys on forums, some really cool opportunities came my way for some public speaking and some media appearances. And I've been doing public activism and speaking and whatever comes my way since then. And it's been an incredible journey. And it's so crazy to me that still to this day, more people aren't talking about it. And I'm still right here passionate about raising awareness because I know so many people are still hurting. And that's why I'm thankful that you're letting me share today.
Oh, I'm just so grateful. So can you take us back? Because one of the things that I have difficulty is trying to get through to parents how early we need to have this conversation. And I've heard you talk in the past about, you were quite young in your first exposure. So can you take us right back to, how it all started?
Yeah. So I first stumbled on a pornographic magazine. I don't remember, it was Playboy or Hustler or something like that, when I was around 8 years old. I was playing hide and go seek in the neighborhood, and for whatever reason, so many people have the story of finding a magazine under some bushes or something like that. Probably an older brother or someone hiding it for their secret stash. But the little kids always stumble into those kind of things, and that's what we did. And I knew what masturbation was at the time. So I actually started masturbating to the magazine around 8 or 9 years old, pretty young. And then I started watching softcore porn on TV late at night. You know, my parents thought I was asleep, and I'd sneak out of bed and turn the TV on and watch whatever I could until, you know, the wee hours of the morning, sometimes 1 or 2 a.m. or later. And they had no idea. And things got really bad when I was 12. And that was around the turn of the century, 1999, I believe. My parents got high-speed internet. This was when, you know, DSL was blowing up and everyone was getting high-speed internet at home. And before my parents got home, I would beat them home from middle school or junior high. And I would have a little bit of window where I could, you know, look up whatever I wanted to online. And some of my friends were more tech savvy than me, and they would give me tips and tricks of free websites where I could download whatever I wanted to. Back then, it was like file sharing sites like Kazaa or LimeWire, and teach me, you know, how to hide it from my parents, like clear your history and stuff. And then, you know, I continued to watch porn through middle school and high school, but I also became sexually active at the age of 14. And I like to say that's when a battle began for my libido, for my pursuit of real life partners, if you will, and my pursuit of porn. And ultimately leading into college, that's when porn ended up winning that battle. And it became the only thing that could sexually arouse me. And I, you know, ended up in a place where I had erectile dysfunction, you know, low libido for real partnered sex. My sexual taste had completely morphed, and I was watching stuff that I used to find repulsive. And I had a lot of other side effects, like poor working memory, brain fog, mental clarity was gone, you know, some heightened anxiety. And when I finally figured out what my problem was and quit, I did go through some withdrawal. You know, for behavioral addictions, it's typically stress and irritability and maybe trouble sleeping and stuff like that. And that's what happened in my case. But eventually, after 9 months in my case, I finally regained the ability to have successful sex again and function normally. And all the other effects continued to go away as I, you know, my abstinence from porn went on. And yeah, so it's, yeah.
You've covered so many amazing things there. One of the things I want to touch on is, you know, going back to the either the Playboy or the Hustler or whatever it is. When I do parent workshops, one of the things I say is, and you're not probably even going to know what this is because you're quite a bit younger than I am, but when I was 19, I saw one Emmanuel movie. And because parents think when I talk about porn, they go back to their childhood and they think about the Hustler or the Playboy in the Big Brother's cupboard or whatever. But, you know, the Emmanuel movie, we have a channel here in Australia called SBS. And nowadays, Emmanuel would be on SBS because it was so tame. I thought I was the most risque girl ever. And oh my goodness. And but nowadays that would just be so mainstream, it wouldn't even, you know, people wouldn't even raise an eyebrow. So, you know, the fact that it took you, you know, parents don't realize about the, you know, porn, you know, people think of Pornhub and all the different genres and stuff like that. You know, children, very young children, when I'm working with kids, I'll say, where, I don't call it pornography when I'm working with children under 10, I call them private pictures or private movies. And I'll say to the children, where could kids see pictures or movies with people with no clothes on? And, you know, 5-year-olds will tell me, I was in one school and a little girl put up a hand and said, Snapchat. And I said, sweetie, you're 5. How do you know about Snapchat? And obviously she had a 14-year-old sister who was using it for sending nudes because that she knew about it. Other kids will say, I've had a little boy put up his hand and say, oh, it's easy, miss. You just type in XXX at 5. Another little girl's put up her hand and said, oh, miss, it's easy. You just ask Siri.
Oh my gosh.
Don't be asking Siri to find your pictures.
It's a serious problem.
But, you know, kids are seeing on shows like Family Guy about, you know, ZooTube and things like that. So when they hear something, they're going to go and Google it. And, you know, my big message to parents is be your child's Google. Don't ever say go and Google
Absolutely.
it, because you don't want them Googling,
Yeah.
ZooTube and things like that, because kids will hear stuff in the playground or on TV shows, and their minds are going to be blown. So,
and there was one study that found a majority of young kids do stumble on porn accidentally. So
yes.
even if they're Googling something that you would think would be safe, they can stumble into porn accidentally. Yeah.
Well, and we know that the porn industry is targeting children. They're putting it where children will go. They're sneaky, and a child will make a spelling mistake and end up, down a rabbit hole and things like that. So, but can you explain how the brain works? Because I know that you've done a lot of work around this, that I've had people say to me, oh, Holly, if kids see a naked picture, is it really that bad? And I liken it to, some people say, well, marijuana, it's not that bad, but it can lead to stronger stuff. Kids might just see a naked picture and have a physical reaction, but then the brain wants more and more. So you've had that experience. Can you explain about that?
Yeah, there's a couple things there. I think one thing you were getting at, and I think it's really important to point out, is internet porn is not a picture. It's not a Playboy magazine. It's what scientists call a supernormal stimulus. It's more stimulating than anything that can be found in nature. There was a researcher named Nicholas Tinbergen who coined the phrase supernormal stimuli. And he's he won the Nobel Prize for it, where he could dupe birds to preferring fake eggs over real. They would sit on these big, colorful eggs that he would paint because the bird thought that egg had a more strong, better offspring in it. And then the same thing with beetles. There's Australia jewel beetles actually will mate with brown beer bottles that have dimples on them because they think that's a big, healthy, beautiful brown female beetle. And they actually, I think the alcohol industry actually changed beer bottles just so those beetles wouldn't go extinct. I heard that the other day. But the point there is anything that is naturally compelling, naturally rewarding, like junk food, video games, internet porn, our brains naturally find that stuff rewarding. But when we get, we chronically consume it, it becomes more stimulating than the real thing. And then we neglect the real thing. And that's what you're seeing happen with internet porn is young kids are growing up on a steady diet of internet porn. And when they reach adulthood, they can't function sexually and they have low libido for actual sex with their real partners. But from a brain perspective, anything that is novel, shocking, surprising releases more dopamine. And internet porn is a novelty producing machine. There's no end to how many videos you can swipe and click on. And one thing like I personally got hooked on was compilation videos. So I reached a point where I was watching, 1,000 different naked people in 3 minutes. The scene would change every second. So I was constantly seeing new shocking images of some of the most intense parts of porn scenes. And, this is just a dopamine producing machine. And eventually that leads to desensitization. And that chronic dopamine releases other proteins that rewire the brain and create that, that condition like Pavlov's dog pathway to where you now associate that stimulus with reward. And, it plays itself out neurologically. There's 4 main addiction related brain changes that, by the way, kids and adolescents are more vulnerable to. That's sensitization, which is like a super memory of pleasure, right? Your brain wires to something to where it reaches a point where that's the most valuable thing in the brain's reward list. And then it sees that as more valuable than what's natural, real intimacy, real connection with a partner. Then there's desensitization, where the brain becomes numbed. And so everything else seems boring and, just unpleasant and not that pleasurable. And it's kind of a double-edged sword. Once you have the desensitization, you still have the sensitization. And so the only thing that's appealing to your numbed brain is that super memory of pleasure you created to whatever you're addicted to, like internet porn. And then you have hypofrontality. This refers to the frontal lobes. Hypo means functioning less than normal. And frontality just refers to the prefrontal cortex. And that's kind of the decision-making part of the brain. And once you develop that addiction-related brain change, your decision-making is impaired, and then you'll go choose whatever you're addicted to over normal, healthy behaviors and decisions. And then lastly, altered stress response. This is kind of a new discovery in the addiction field the last decade. They really have found that when you develop an addiction, stress really activates that highway that you've created. So you it's almost like, soothing your stress with whatever it is you're addicted to. And that actually, it can be behind cravings too. When you're uncomfortable, when you're irritable, when you're stressed or anxious, then you crave, that activates that craving for whatever it is you're addicted to. And this is, definitely what's happening with a lot of young people when they haven't really developed that resiliency to life stress, but they've consumed this super normal stimulus of internet porn all through their most, moldable developmental years. And it's leading to a lot of young people that are more lonely than ever, more anxious than ever, depressed, but yet they're hooked on their screens. And a lot of them are hooked on internet porn.
Yeah. When I'm working with 14-year-old young men in high school, they admit to me of watching 2 hours a week of pornography. I know they're watching way more. They're just the old lady at the front. They'll just tell her 2 hours to shut her up, sort of thing. But I'll say, fellas, why are you looking at that? And they'll say, oh, miss, to learn technique or to learn style. And I'll stop right there because it's not the right technique and there's no style. But there's no kissing. There's no foreplay. There's no pleasure for women. There's no consent. And they'll say to me, oh, miss, but we know it's not real. But then I go and explain, like you just have, about the dopamine and how our brain can't tell the difference between seeing something and doing something. And, they just don't get it. I relate it to sport because sport here in Australia is huge. I say it's why, athletes visualize winning the race. Mm-hmm. It's you're programming your brain. And so one of the favorite sayings that I hear you say all the time is no screen will ever love you back.
Yeah.
Young people, just in my experience, they don't, they'll say they know it's not real. And when I'm working with young females in schools, they'll say, oh, miss, when I get old, I'm never having sex. It's so filthy. It's so disgusting, because boys during the recess and lunch breaks are either showing them or describing the most heinous acts. Yeah. And one of the classes that I had these, and I won't say it on here, but I had these young men describing what they were watching. And it was absolutely heinous. And they're saying, oh, but miss, it's just so funny. And so I'm going, well, that's somebody's sister, that's somebody's daughter, that's not a hunk of meat. They've been so desensitized. And my worry for these young people, these are 14-year-old young men, in 10 years, when these are going to be our future police, teachers, doctors, parents, and, they're being so desensitized to, what a woman's needs are and stuff like that. So, here in Australia, we like to think we're very progressive, but we really are lousy at teaching sex education. And I'm not talking about what goes where, but, we need to do better at talking about consent, talking about what a healthy relationship looks like and things like that. So as part of your work, is that something that you cover as well?
As far as the education front, what I'm most passionate about is including in sex education the basics of the brain's reward circuit and sexual conditioning. So I like to teach, especially when I'm talking to teenagers, I like to teach them the why. Why are they watching what they're watching? If they have escalated into abusive, misogynistic content, well, why is that even arousing in the first place? And there's two reasons. One, like I mentioned earlier, anything that's shocking or even anxiety producing can increase arousal. But two, it might be because of the desensitization where they have escalated to need a bigger neurochemical hit. And so that, you can always hear a pin drop when I'm talking to high school guys when I say that, because they're like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. Because for me personally, when I escalated into stuff that I found repulsive, I escalated into some misogynistic porn, and I always felt not like moral shame about it, but I felt gross. Like I felt, why am I watching this? I was always confused. And so when you explain the sexual conditioning, it really clicks with them, and they can start to understand why that content's being produced from a capitalistic perspective of creating a product that hooks people, that's more stimulating. They can understand that. And they can also understand it from an addiction perspective, where they have now escalated into it, and it's like Pavlov's dog getting programmed into their brain. And that's why when they open up their browser, their mind goes back to that stimulus that they've been watching. And as far as consent goes, yes, I always do that second though. And that's just strategy wise. I think when you're talking to kids, they immediately are going to think you're ignorant or prude. That's just how teenagers are wired when you're, an older person lecturing them about sex.
At least you're a handsome young man. Imagine me, fat old lady out the front talking about this stuff that nobody's ever talked to them about before. They go, whoa, by the end of it, I can't get them to. They love it.
Yeah.
They just want more, but it's not easy.
It's not easy, but I think with the right framing, I think anyone can do it. Right. And that's what I found to be most helpful, is starting from a health perspective, using the brain science.
Yeah.
And you don't even have to, this is just a tip for anyone that wants to talk to young, even children or teens about porn. You don't have to start with porn. If you start with, I like to start with junk food and video games personally, and then social media, because all young people know that they don't feel good, either sharp mentally or just good about their productivity in the day, or good about forming real interpersonal relationships face to face, if they're spending too much time on screens, or if they're eating a bunch of junk food and then they're trying to play sports or something like that. They can feel that they don't feel good. And then that's a perfect opportunity to explain the basic brain science of when they consume something super stimulating, or, they're trying to connect with 5,000 people that they don't know on social media. That hurts their ability to connect to the 5 most important people in the real life. And same with junk food. If they're eating a steady diet of junk food, they're not fueling their body with what they need, and it's desensitizing them to your fruits and veggies that you do need to have a healthy athletic body. And so that's a good way in, and it teaches the basic brain science. And then you have the segue into porn, and it's the same thing. It's wiring themselves to something that they're not designed to connect with, which is a phone or a laptop. And I've had kids as young as, I had a 12-year-old fall after I gave a talk to a group of 12, 13, 14-year-olds. A 12-year-old raised his hand and said, well, how do I get my dopamine to fire for, healthy things? And like, I was blown away at the question, like such a great question. And just so everyone knows, like I've had some people say, well, kids aren't going to know what you're talking about with neuroscience and stuff. It's like, yes, they do. You don't have to get all crazy with it. They understand the process of, wiring your brain to something. It's just learning. It's learning on steroids. And they, young kids can understand that. But with all of that said, I know I'm long-winded here, but if you start with that, you have their attention. They know that you have their best interest in mind. And then, you can get into what healthy consent looks like and is real consent. Because, your high school jock football player guy is not going to tune you out. He's going to be listening to you. And then you can feed him in the real, like what healthy masculinity is and consent and all that fun stuff that's really important. You'll have their attention. And that's what I found to be most helpful.
Beautiful. I mean, I do that with 6-year-olds. I get all the kids, I've got them all, 30 or up to 50 kids sitting on the floor, and I've got them all to get their fingertips and put them all together. Our brains are amazing, and they're made up of all these connections. But if you see pictures or movies, keeping no clothes on, it changes the connections in your brain, and they're all doing this. And then I say, and if you see pictures like that, it releases a chemical in your brain called dopamine. Now, if I'm running around, my brain will create a little bit of dopamine to say, hey, Holly, keep running around. Or if I eat chocolate, a little bit of dopamine to say, hey, Holly, have another chocolate.
Mm-hmm.
But if you see pictures or movies of people in clothes, it's like a flood of this dopamine in your brain, and your brain loves it, but it tricks your brain. And so 6-year-olds totally understand it. It's not I love the fact that it's not a values thing. It's not a religious thing. If we use science, then, you know, they like you said, they do get it. And I believe that 6-year-olds can understand it. And well, I've had children, you know, come up after sessions. One school I was at, I had 24 7-year-olds, and of the 24 7-year-olds, 8 of them had seen pornography on YouTube. Not one child had told a parent. They all came up individually and said, oh, miss, I've got something to tell you. Oh, miss, I've got something to tell you, sort of thing. Not one child had told a parent for fear of getting into trouble or having the device taken away.
Yep.
So that's, you know, that's what, a third of that class, no, a fourth of that class had seen porn by 7. And there's nothing special about that school. It's just in an average area, in an average suburb. So, you know, we were saying earlier, it will find them. They don't even need to go looking for it. And that's why I believe that education early, and not just the one-off, you know, I need parents to say, if you see something, come and show me. I used to, and I've written 2 books, and I know you have them, bless you. When I wrote my books, I wrote them to help parents have these conversations. And one of them is, you know, I tell the kids the process of what to do if you see it. And I used to say, go and tell an adult, until 2020 here in April. We'd just gone into lockdown here in Australia, and somebody had tagged me into child exploitation material. They'd come across something really heinous on Instagram and didn't know how to deal with it. Yeah. So they've put at Safe for Kids, which is me, at FBI, at Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, which is where it will eventually end up. And so I open up this, I get messages all the time. I open up this video, burst into tears, could not believe what I was seeing. I still had enough wherewithal to go, right, well, I need to take a screenshot of the guy's face, but not what he was doing, a screenshot of his page. I go back out to take a screenshot of the person that had sent it to me, but it had disappeared. I then go online, I make a report, crying my eyes out. I go into up into our house, because my office is in the bottom of our garden, and I tell my husband exactly what I saw. And my husband's gone, oh, yeah. What do you mean? Oh, yeah. I'm almost hysterical about what I'm describing.
Yeah.
But I see it. That was nearly 2 years ago. I still have flashbacks about what I saw. But I see it as a gift, because I've gone, well, if I can't relay to my husband what I saw, how is a 6-year-old or a 12-year-old going to tell a parent about what they saw? I saw somebody with people no clothes on. That's not what they saw. And because children are describing flashbacks, they don't know the words, but they say, Holly, the picture just pops into our heads and stuff like that. So they're describing flashbacks, they're describing nightmares. I know children that think that dad is doing that to mum. So this is why I'm so passionate about trying to educate parents about how to have these conversations, and also give kids strategies about, you know, if you see something, turn it over, go and show an adult. But if it pops into your brain, try and reboot your brain, because you know, even 6-year-olds know about rebooting a computer. So, you know, I teach to close your eyes and imagine something that you like to see or you like to do, because we can train our brains not to think about that bad thing. Because, you know, parents really, they don't know how to deal with it. And recently I did a poll on my Instagram account. Have you had a conversation? And I think it was 60-40. 40% had a conversation and 60 hadn't. And so if the people that hadn't, I said, why haven't you? And it was, I think they're too young and I don't know where to start and all those things. But of the 40 that had, ironically, it was all after a critical incident. My son did this, or they were talking about this at school, and nobody was actually getting ahead of the game. And I had a mum recently contact me. Her 9-year-old daughter was exposed on an iPad at school to pornography. Now, because it was a school's computer, it should have had a filtering system on, and it did to a degree. She typed in XXX into Google and it was blocked. So she's going, oh, that's strange. Then she's typed in, she's going, oh, I'll try. And she went into Google Images and typed in exactly the same. And her daughter her mind was blown with what she was seeing. But she didn't report it to her mum for about 3 months. And I have consent to tell this story. The mum wants people to know, because she would have said, there's no way my daughter would have, she would have thought her daughter would have looked at that. But it was just another child at school saying, oh, if you type in XXX, see what you get, sort of thing. And so it only came about because after 3 months, the 9-year-old said to her mum, what's it called when you don't want to live anymore? And she just was so traumatized by what she saw and how she felt disgusted and horrid at 9. And so, for me, if we can get parents to be proactive, have these conversations as early as possible, so that if they do see something, they do hear something, they're going to know what to do. And then the parent can help debrief them about it.
Yeah, I think the earlier, the better. I mean, that situation you just described is absolutely heartbreaking. And I think that's every parent's worst nightmare. A lot of parents, there's a few reasons why they're hesitant. You always hear it said that it's going to take away a kid's curiosity. And I like to say, it doesn't take away their innocence. It takes away their ignorance. And taking away the curiosity isn't necessarily a bad thing. I like to flip that around. I stayed away from hard drugs because my parents took away my curiosity about drugs. I was informed on the potential negative effects. And so I decided to make a healthy decision and avoid that through my teenage years. And glad I did. The same thing's true for pornography. If you explain how this can impact you and the potential negative effects, it's the same thing. They're still going to be, giddy and excited and curious about real connection when they grow up. You're just taking away that taboo and unknown feeling about this stimulus, just like drugs that everyone's going to be talking about when they get to middle school, high school. And the fact that they'll be educated from a science perspective, they might even feel like cool and they might fire back to the school bully some educated answer and make the bully run away. It's something really cool like that could happen. And I've had that happen before. I know it has. And so when you empower your kids with information, they want to steer themselves to a healthy life. Every kid has goals and passions, and they want to be successful in life and form great friendships and, play sports or achieve whatever their goals are. And if they know something's going to negatively impact them and keep them from their goals, they'll typically do it. Now, there's a lot of psychology that could go in for the ones that rebel and stuff like that, but it's not because they were just curious. I think that every parent can rest assured that if you talk to your kids as early as possible, it's only a good thing. They will be informed and they will no longer be ignorant of something that can really screw them up, like you just described with that girl. That, being exposed to violent, hardcore porn when you're a child is traumatic. There's a lot of mental health experts and psychologists and professionals that will tell you that it's traumatic. And it can be way less so if they are educated and prepared for that, so to know what it is, to know that they don't have to hide it in shame, and to know that there's a healthy communication line with the parent. I know you like to say you need to be your child's Google, and that's exactly what you should do. The child should know that there's no conversation that's off limits with you. And I think porn is one of the biggest ones that needs to be clear that they can come and talk to you about that.
Perfect. And that leads perfectly into, the program that we teach. We have 2 themes. We all have the right to feel safe all of the time. and we can talk to someone about anything. And these are the anythings that we need: sex, relationships. You know, one of the things I do with children is to help them set up a safety team of 5 adults that they can talk to. So if they, and on the thumb would be their parent, and then 2 people from school, and then 2 people from the community, like aunts and uncles and neighbors and stuff.
Yeah.
But if children don't think that they can go to their parent because their parent will take the iPad away, who else can you talk to about this sort of stuff? Because, you know, especially teenagers, you know, I say to teenagers, to young fellas, well, if you want to know about sex, who do you talk to? Oh, my mate. Yeah, well, your mate's watching the same porn you're watching, not the good information. Yeah. Which adults could you go and talk to about, you know, and kids want to know about how do you break up with somebody? You know, they want to know all of those. They know the plumbing stuff. They know what goes where. But in my experience here in Australia, I can't say for the US, but here in Australia, most sex education is, you know, unwanted pregnancies and wearing protection so you don't get an STI. But, you know, where's the respect for relationships? Where's what a healthy relationship looks like?
Yeah.
You know, we've had a big thing here in Australia about earlier in the year. So in Australia, we've got our Australian of the Year. Her name is Grace Tane, and she was a survivor of child sexual abuse. She was abused by a teacher at school. And so for a year in Australia, it's had a real high, child abuse has had a real high profile. Then we had a young woman come out about she was raped in our parliament, and then another young woman came forward and put out a survey and had 5,000 young women sign the survey and leave their stories about how they were raped in, you know, prestigious by prestigious boys' schools, kids in boys' schools and things. And so it's had a very big emphasis on consent. But, you know, we need to teach consent from here. I mean, you've got a young 6-month-old at the moment. And if you were holding him and I wanted to have a cuddle, I'd go, hey, bub, can I have a cuddle? And I'd put out my arms. If he came to me, I'd take him. But if he cuddled into you, I wouldn't take him. So, you know, we have to teach consent, model consent from a very young age so that kids know that they have body autonomy. They're the boss of their bodies. They don't owe anybody anything. And so, you know, if parents can just get educated about this so that, you know, you talked about mental health issues of our children, you know, what I'm saying, because I've been teaching this for over 35 years now, you know, the decline since the iPhone, the decline in children's mental health, you know, when I'm helping children set up a safety team, because on the thumb goes somebody from their home, and I'll have children going, oh, Holly, I don't want anybody from my home on my safety team. Mum's always on Facebook, or dad comes to my cricket match and he never watches. He's always on his phone. So kids are really disconnected. Yep. And I want to help parents reconnect with their children so that they can be their child's Google.
Yeah. The more, that reminds me of the phrase, the more connected we get online, we can get disconnected in real life. And that it's sad how that's playing it out. Definitely.
Gabe, look, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I will, in the notes, I will link people to your, all your sites and everything. Where is the best place for people to find you though? YouTube is, you know, where I put out informational and educational videos, Rebootnation on YouTube. But if you want to, you know, follow me or contact me, Instagram and Twitter, just at Gabe Deem is my handle. And then I also run the recovery website, Rebootnation.org, if anyone is interested in a free place where you can be anonymous and just get help and encouragement and advice along the way of the road of recovery. That's phenomenal. I have to say, I've shared your video, the cartoon video that you've just released, so many times. I love it. Congratulations on getting that, because I think, you know, it's those sort of resources that, you know, help, you know, teachers can have a conversation using that video. So thank you so much for all the work that you're doing in this field and spending this time with us.
Yep. Thanks for having me. I hope it's helpful.